Violence against women and girls is a serious problem here, and the statistics bear it out. Northern Ireland has the joint highest rate in Europe of women murdered by a man known to them. Last year, the PSNI sent 1,568 files to the PPS in respect of sexual violence, resulting in only 8 convictions for rape. And every 17 minutes, the PSNI respond to a call relating to domestic abuse. Even our own executive recognises this. In March of this year, a debate took place in the Assembly which reached the conclusion that we do need a violence against women and girls strategy in Northern Ireland. Indeed, we'll be the last jurisdiction on these islands to have one. We're still waiting for that strategy, and while work begins in Stormont, we thought that we would open a discussion on what we want in that strategy. So it's more than just a piece of paper that gathers dust. What we really need is something that can lead to a change in our dismal statistics and in the forces that drive those statistics. And thank you to the Northern Ireland Human Rights Festival for hosting us to have this discussion. Raise Your Voice is a partnership project of the Women's Resource and Development Agency, the Northern Ireland Rural Women's Network, the Women's Support Network, and Reclaim the Agenda. And it focuses on tackling sexual harassment and violence in communities in Northern Ireland. We wanted to broaden the scope of expertise today, and so we've invited along speakers who will give insight beyond our expertise. So today we are joined by Danielle Roberts from HereNI, a charity that supports lesbian and bisexual women and their families, Ivanka Antova from the Human Rights Consortium, and both Sonia Mullan and Devlin from the Women's Aid Federation. I will chair the discussion, and at the end, we will open it up for questions and comments from attendees. But as we go along, do feel free to pop any questions into the chat box. So without further ado, we're going to move to the questions. Firstly, and I'll direct this first to those speakers from Women's Aid, what are the main priority issues that your organisation would like to see addressed in the violence against women and girls strategy?
Thank you, Elaine, and thanks everyone for giving us the opportunity to be here today. As Elaine said, in March of this year, Women's Aid launched a petition. Again, we're looking at a violence against women and girls strategy here in Northern Ireland, as we are the only part of the UK and Ireland that don't have such a strategy in place. This is a long-term issue going back to tackling violence at home in the 2005, when that first strategy around domestic violence came into play. It was always very gender-neutral language, not addressing the actual key issues of the crimes that disproportionately affect women and girls here in Northern Ireland. We're so far behind in relation to this piece of work. If we look at England, Scotland, Wales, they've had strategies in place for many years, for over a decade. And we are playing catch up in relation to this, but also, of course, in relation to all the other pieces of legislation that we don't have. So, the main key themes are not going to be very different to any other violence against women and girls strategy in other parts of the UK and other jurisdictions. And, the main things we're looking at are prevention and early intervention. Too many people are reaching our, systems, Women's Aid may be, or our justice systems at that point of crisis. So greater investment in early intervention and prevention, and not rocket science at all. Supporting victims and survivors as well, looking at what that looks like. We don't have appropriate or accurate or really good data sets here in Northern Ireland. So how on earth do we know what support our victims and survivors need against all of these different forms of violence against women and girls? Education as well is key, and there's a lot of debate around RSE, primary, post-primary education around that. I'll not go into all of that now, as it would take well over an hour just to talk about that one subject, but we know we've all been very vocal around those key issues. Public awareness as well. We have to get to the root of all these problems, don't we? Why on earth in Northern Ireland, if we have, strategies that function and work and we have enough funding and all, well, why on earth do we have these staggering statistics, which are absolutely frightening, as Elaine has said, with regard to our femicide? 1.8 million people here in Northern Ireland, very small population, but indeed we still have the highest rates of femicide in Europe again this year. And there's been 11 women have been murdered from the 23rd of March 2020, and just absolutely staggering. So a lot of the work that we need to do is around the monitoring of a strategy as well, the scrutinisation of that, and who's going to do that. And that's what will make any strategy work, as well as public awareness, perpetrator programs as well, looking at management of offenders as well. But the big piece as well is that data set collection and the way we collect, our data. If we're going to make any real changes in relation to tackling any form of violence against women and girls, we need to do it in a trauma-informed way as well. And that's something, that we feel very, very strongly about within Women's Aid. But we're glad that we've got to this place, that the Executive Office have moved forward now. They've appointed individuals. They actually have a Ending Violence Against Women and Girls Directorate as part of the Executive Office. So look, this is really, really big. And we were calling for, a Safeguarding Women's Minister, that kind of thing. And maybe we'll get a minister out of this as well, but we have to keep pushing and pushing. It's very early stages and we need to be part of and fundamental to every discussion that happens within the sector, that we all feel we have ownership of this strategy, and as well victims and survivors are key, absolutely key to this work and our functioning at all. So I will just stop there and let everyone else have an opportunity.
Thank you so much, Sonia. I'm going to pass over to Ivanka now.
Thanks, Elaine, and hi, everyone. I'm very glad to be here as the research officer for the Human Rights Consortium, but also in a private capacity as the convener of United Against Racism Belfast, which is an all-Ireland grassroots anti-racism platform. So I'm not an expert in domestic violence or gender-based violence, but I'm here to chime in from a human rights perspective and hopefully offer some helpful thoughts on what perhaps racialized minorities, migrant communities, and minority ethnic people might wish to see from such a strategy. So I'll speak as a combination of both the Human Rights Consortium and United Against Racism Belfast, without the two being connected. So from a consortium point of view, we're quite concerned with the overall context in which such a strategy would be conceived and carried forward. And for us, the key is, of course, a human rights framework. Very often in Northern Ireland, human rights are seen as something which is not necessary. And instead, we talk about values and principles. For the Human Rights Consortium, it's incredibly important that we have a strong, a comprehensive and a robust Bill of Rights that guarantees legally enforceable rights of women, of Black and minority ethnic people, of migrant communities, refugees and asylum seekers, all marginalized communities that are suffering disproportionately the impact of gender-based violence. So we want to see legally enforceable rights as opposed to anything less. And connected with this, a priority for, I'm sure for all of us, would be to recognize gender-based violence, violence against women and girls, as a human rights issue. And I'm sure to many of us here, it's natural, it's logical, it's instinctive to think that this is a human rights issue. But as far as international and domestic law are concerned, that connection is not necessarily that straightforward. So for example, it wasn't until 2009 with the famous Opus versus Turkey case in the European Court of Human Rights that we saw a decision by an international court that recognized domestic violence as a human rights issue, as opposed to an issue which is connected with family, relationships, something which is private, something which is individual. Once we recognize gender-based violence as a human rights violation, as a human rights issue, then we think it's important to mainstream a human rights approach to crises such as violence against women and girls. And such an approach, the mainstreaming of such an approach would include equality impact assessments of all measures, strategies, tools, anything that we develop. It would require to pass a very rigorous test to ensure that it's actually effective for all these communities that face additional barriers when it comes to the protection of their safety as well as their human rights. and I'm sorry if I'm hyperventilating here, it's just there is so much we need to say from a human rights perspective. We would also want to see domestic as well as international, but for us specifically domestic legislation being strengthened and updated, because very often we operate in a very outdated legal framework, which doesn't allow the responses to be very robust. For example, it's absolutely wonderful that in 2021, we achieved an amendment of Section 1 of the Domestic Abuse and Civil Proceedings Act that recognize coercive control within the broader framework of domestic violence. But very often the legal frameworks with which we operate are outdated. And as Karen and Sonia pointed out, Northern Ireland is very often behind Ireland and the rest of the UK in terms of both human rights standards and specifically domestic violence legislation and procedures. And there is also the dreaded B word. A big chunk of the consortium's work at the moment is to ensure that post-Brexit, there isn't a rollback on human rights. We are doing a lot of work on Article 2 of the Northern Ireland Protocol that ensures that rights will be protected. So for us, a priority would be in the context of conceiving and pushing forward for that strategy would be to ensure that post-Brexit human rights will not be rolled back. Instead, they will be strengthened, they will be enforced, and they can then be the foundation upon which this strategy can blossom and become very effective. And I will speak about that more in the next questions, but obviously any strategy that doesn't recognize these specific and additional barriers that racialized minorities and migrant communities face is bound to not be very effective. So a priority from a UAR point of view would be the effective and consistent communication and consultation with ethnic minority groups and their representatives to ensure that the strategy caters for them as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Ivanka, and fantastic contribution so far. I'll just pass over to Danielle Roberts now from HereNI.
Hello. Yes, so I'm Danielle from HereNI. We're an organisation that supports and advocates for lesbian and bisexual women and their families. We're the only women-focused LGBT organisation in Northern Ireland. And jointly with Cara Friend, we run the Gendered Violence Project, which is aimed at LGBTQ+ women and girls aged 12+ who are at risk of or who have experienced domestic or sexual violence and abuse. So as part of that, there is one-to-one support offered to victims and survivors, which is a kind of holistic approach. It includes things like mindfulness and meditation as well as personal development. Then the second strand is education and training. So whether that's delivering sort of healthy relationships workshops to youth groups or community organisations, and also training for professionals on specific issues for LGBT women who are experiencing domestic abuse. Quite often, similar to what Ivanka was saying, lesbian and bisexual women who have experienced domestic abuse are further marginalised. So similarly to what Ivanka was sharing about racialised people, Stonewall reports that 1 in 4 lesbian and bisexual women have experienced domestic violence in a relationship, which is in line with 1 in 4 of the general population of women. However, 2/3 of those reporting to Stonewall said the perpetrator was a woman. So that's something that we want to see reflected in the violence against women and girls strategy, is that a recognition of difference and of the different ways violence against women and girls can be perpetrated, whether that's by a perpetrator who's the same gender as you, or somebody who's not an intimate partner, but maybe a family relationship, a sibling or a parent, and just broader than this, like a heterosexual man and woman relationship. So we're hopeful that the strategy will take into account the various differences, and that goes beyond just LGBT issues, but also on, we know that disabled women in particular are vulnerable in different ways to domestic abuse. So something that is broad reaching and takes account of the different ways people can experience domestic abuse. Also, we want it to be not just a strategy. So we want it not just to be something that's on paper and sits on the shelf, but something that has an implementation plan, something that has targets, something that we can hold government to account with. So something that has an action plan and a resource and budget attached to it, and something that explicitly sets out what the strategy is going to do, not something that's just aspirational, but something that's enforceable. So we'd be wanting to see targets and timelines, so that then if they aren't delivered on, we can go back and say, yeah, you said you were going to do this, it's your responsibility, so do it. Yeah, I'm not sure whether that's a bit optimistic, but yes, so we want a strategy that's not just a strategy, but that actually makes a difference. Yeah, so that's me for that question. Thank
you so much, Danielle, and I think everybody else as well. I think we're all singing from a similar hymn sheet on this, in that we need a strategy that's quite robust and that we can hold people to account for. So my second question, and I'm going to start this time with Ivanka, is do you know of any examples of good strategies elsewhere in the world that we could learn from, and are there lessons to be learned about what not to do as well?
I'm afraid I couldn't think of a strategy from the international context that I could recommend as a really good example, but I think, and hopefully that's just my own ignorance, I'm here taking notes, hoping that there is such a strategy. But I focused on the second part of the question, which is what hopefully not to do. And I thought that I would give my own country as an example of what not to do. So Bulgaria has an absolutely disastrous record of, first of all, not recognizing that domestic violence and gender-based violence is a thing as far as the Bulgarian establishment is concerned, as well as our equally outdated legal system is concerned. There is no problem. And also a couple of years ago, when countries were asked to ratify the Istanbul Convention, under a lot of pressure from the Bulgarian far right, which is extremely misogynistic, very sexist, very conservative, there was this artificially created hype around gender politics. It's a term taken from, I suppose, Western political and sociological thought that does not necessarily translate into the Bulgarian language. But anyway, the far right stoked that fear of, this is all about gendered politics. We don't have a problem with domestic violence in Bulgaria, and we didn't ratify the Istanbul Convention. So Bulgaria is also going through an endemic of femicide, including a murder on International Day Against Domestic Violence, which I think shocked even a lot of conservative Bulgarians. That on the day when we have very modest protests in Bulgaria against violence, against women and children, even though these protests were modest, I think even conservative Bulgarians were shocked by the prevalence of the problem. There was just this incredibly dark week where several women lost their lives, due to domestic violence. So I suppose that's a lesson of what not to do. Ignore the problem, allow the far right to kidnap the language of empowerment and human rights and equality and the necessity to do something, and just let both the legislative framework and conversations around domestic violence to just fall through the cracks. And as a second, more of a UAR point, I think we all have plenty of examples in our heads where predominantly white Western feminism, kind of steeped into liberal thought, has been somewhat ignorant also ignoring the experiences and lives of women in the global South or racialized minorities, even here in the global North. Around BLM last year, I think all of us got a crash course into how narratives that we take for granted don't necessarily include the experiences of our Black and minority ethnic siblings. So I think one thing not to do, and I'm not saying that we are doing it, I'm just saying that it's a good rule of thumb, is to try and be exclusionary at a time when we need to develop inclusionary language demands, strategies, tools. And I very much agree with Danielle. That includes not just women from a minority ethnic background. To me personally, that includes trans women as well. We now have a wonderful opportunity to make these robust and comprehensive strategies that cater for our society as it is at the moment. And here I'm borrowing the words of my good friend, I'm sure many of you know her, Kumila Manju. I had the chance to listen to Kumila the other day at the Women in Media event. And Kumila said, take a look around, we're all women, we're all feminists, and this is amazing. But the room is not representing of Northern Irish society as it is. And obviously she meant that it was a predominantly white crowd. And I had to think and say, yes, we have to mainstream and mainstream true and effective inclusion and diversity, as opposed to, as Danielle says, aspirational stuff. And that's a good lesson not to repeat from the past, I think. Not that we are, again, I'm just saying in general, it's great not to repeat that. So that's me. I'm afraid that's my only modest contribution here. I couldn't think of a strategy.
That's a fantastic contribution, Ivanka, and thank you for that. And I think it's as important to look at where things have gone wrong elsewhere or in the past and learn from that as it is to look at where it's gone right. So I'm going to pass the same question over to Danielle now.
Over a second.
Thank you. So one good example, so it's just the one that I have, is around data collection. So data collection is something that I know has been mentioned already, and we'll probably talk about more later, but even when LGBTQ+ people report domestic abuse, quite often it isn't recorded in a way that's easy to break down. Particularly, for example, if a bisexual woman reports domestic abuse, quite often her sexual orientation will be kind of determined by who her partner is, who may be the perpetrator, rather than recording her as bisexual. It's often not always something that is even asked about or monitored at all, sexual orientation or gender identity. So we recommend that sexual orientation and gender identity is monitored as standard. Everyone has a sexual orientation and gender identity. If you're heterosexual and cis, that's your sexual orientation and gender identity. So it's not, we need to stop othering people who aren't heterosexual and or cis. So the Greater Manchester Police have started recording sexual orientation and gender identity, and they reported back that around 2% of the domestic abuse recorded by the Greater Manchester Police was experienced by LGBT people. That's still less than what would be expected. Safe Lives have reported that they would expect it to be around 5% of domestic abuse cases reported. But it still highlighted that there was, while it was a relatively small number by the percentage, it was still nearly 800 people. So there was still a big amount of people who needed tailored support. And what Greater Manchester Police also did was they didn't just monitor the data, but they, in medium and high risk cases, they referred people on for support, and nearly 3/4 of people took up the support who were referred on for it. So they accessed specialised support as well. So it wasn't just, because as we know, cases don't, I was going to say don't always go to court, but quite often, or more often than not, don't progress through the criminal justice system. So it wasn't just recording the data, but it was also referring people on for support that met their needs. So that is a good example. So maybe that's something that could be replicated, but we would specifically want sexual orientation and gender identity to be monitored when there is reporting. We also would like to see sustainable specialised support. There's a few examples in other places. There's Gallup have produced best practice guides for people providing support services. But just to highlight what not to do is to leave it down to basically charities funded by charities, but to mainstream support services. Because I've mentioned the Gendered Violence Project, that is funded by Comic Relief, and that funding runs out at the end of this year, which is not that far away. So there needs to be, so what not to do is, allow projects to fall away. So that is something we're looking at, the work that my colleague Amanda is doing, and all the women that she's supporting. We can't just withdraw that support. There needs to be something for them. So yes, so what not to do is not fund things. That's a lot of negatives in a sentence that might not make sense, but something good to do would be to actually mainstream funding for targeted specialised services, as well as the more mainstream services, or have specific strands.
Absolutely. Thank you, Danielle. And I think we all know that as well as a lack of funding for specialist services, there's also a shortage of funding for the mainstream services as well. So no matter what way you look, there's still a lack where there should be better provision. So I'll pass the same question now on to Women's Aid, Sonia or Karen, whoever wishes to speak.
Thank you very much. And there's a lot to be said with regard to what is going on at the moment. And I suppose for me, since we've started doing this piece of work, we are looking at all the strategies. For example, in England, Scotland and Wales, on paper, they're all really, really good. So it's not actually the strategy, it's the implementation of same, it's the funding of same, it's the targeted approach to those specialised services, it's that rights-based approach as well, with regard to everything from the definition should be rights-based, as I said as well, about that trauma-informed piece as well. And it's the implementation and the accountability, of course, that comes from all of it. If we look at some of the negatives, I suppose for us, if we look at the strategy in England and Wales, they have removed, or they've split really domestic abuse from the main strategy, which we feel is not something we would want to do, definitely not, because domestic violence and abuse is a form of violence against women and girls. So it's interesting the way that model has developed in England. So we really don't think, we think any separation is a disaster for that cohesive response to domestic abuse and all forms of violence against women and girls. So that's some not so good practice that we would like to highlight from England. So, if we look at Scotland, then the funding, the Equally Safe Violence Against Women and Girls, they have a fund, and there's been over 19.5 million invested in that fund from 2015, and they really have a very good way. The government is working on this very well. So I think with regard to their strategy for preventing and eradicating violence against women and girls, there's an average 6.5 million investment there in Scotland, and they're really moving forward. And we're hoping actually to get Nicola Sturgeon over in the new year to talk about this with us. So we're hoping whenever we're allowed out and about again, because Women's Aid in Scotland have been so supportive of the campaign with regard to the strategy. and we've linked in with them. So I think, you know, we have to be mindful. There's an awful lot of good. If we're looking at a written document, a lot of it is very good. I outlined the key themes that we think are really, really important. And of course, that's not taken away from, you know, that rights-based approach, because that's what it should be, you know. And I suppose if we look at equal access to rights, that doesn't mean equal access, you know, to services, because everybody should be treated very, very differently. And we, of course, think that specialism is key. I suppose whenever you look at mainstream as that women's aid, because we're funded mainstream because we are the main domestic abuse strategy, our domestic abuse agency here in Northern Ireland. And I suppose if we look at England and Wales and Scotland, it is fragmented, or it's separated more, but we are the lead agency here, and we would get the biggest pot of funding around support, I suppose, in relation to refuge and floating support, but it is needed. We are underfunded. And I suppose if you look at all of us now, more and more we're looking to individual grants and other funding streams, and that pot of money, that statutory pot of money, is reducing for all of us. And I totally agree with Danielle. You know, I'm on the board of CaraFriend, and that Amanda's project is just absolutely fundamental, and what the outputs and what it has achieved in this short time, it should be, you know, something that should not be just swept away and taken away. It's achieved so much, and hopefully we'll be able to get that kept on in some shape or form. And you know, it's absolutely fundamental. So I suppose it's more than a written document, is what all of us are agreeing on very, very clearly, but it's that monitoring of same, that scrutinisation. That's why, you know, we have this victim of crimes commissioner that we're getting, but is that something that's going to be able, that role, is that something that's going to be able to monitor? Is this directorate, the Ending Violence Against Women and Girls Directorate, are they going to be monitoring themselves then? You know, if we look at the current strategy on domestic and sexual violence and abuse here in Northern Ireland, it doesn't cut it. And we know that. We're going into year 6 of this 7-year strategy. And what has it achieved whenever we have 11 women that have been murdered in the last, you know, from the 23rd of March 2020. So something is definitely not working. And I know, you know, we're going on, we'll be talking about investment, but definitely we need that scrutinisation oversight committee, whatever that looks like. You know, if we look at the volume of legislation that is sitting, and I challenged the Justice Committee on that one last week, if we had a violence against women and girls strategy, you know, how whenever you're drafting and looking at new legislation, so they're looking at the Justice Bill at the moment, they're looking at the Stalking Bill, they're looking at a separate legislation for non-fatal strangulation, all of those, would that look differently for them? And how do you draft legislation whenever these are crimes that disproportionately affect women and girls, but they have to be gender neutral? So there's a real challenge there for all of us to hold them to account, but we need specific mechanisms to be able to do those, and specific monitoring tools.
That's fantastic. Thank you, Sonia. I think, again, it's a case of singing from the same hymn sheet. And the next question will give everyone a chance to develop the discussion about what we need in terms of prevention and investment and so on. Before I go to that question, I just want to remind everyone that if you want to ask a question, you can either wait until we're finished and raise your hand, or you can drop questions into the chat. And I see we've got a few there already. I'm going to gather them all up and ask them to all the speakers together at the end. So last question, I'm going to Danielle first on this one. We know that resourcing will be key to the strategy if it's to achieve prevention. What kind of things do you think we need to think about as a long-term preventative strategy?
So yes, I know we've talked about resourcing a bit already, and yes, you've said it is key, and I think that really can't be emphasized enough. All the asks that are going to be in a violence against women and girls strategy, somebody has to deliver them, and that can't just be done on goodwill. Something else that we would like to see is co-design, so meaningful co-design of any policies and procedures. So whether that's in institutions like PSNI or health trusts, as well as legislation, that all Section 75 groups would be recognised and represented as specialists and experts. I've spoken a bit about data recording before and how that often doesn't reflect bisexual women in particular. So things like that could be raised if there's people represented around the table who have experience of particular issues. We also would like there to be mandatory training on best practice for police officers and healthcare providers on things like using gender neutral pronouns and sexual orientation awareness, and kind of taking out that, because quite often I feel whenever I recommend that people start collecting data on sexual orientation and gender identity, they're like, oh, I can't ask questions about that, that's too private. So it's like it's treated as a different category, whereas you're asking somebody what age they are, you're probably asking somebody what religious background they come from, because of where we are. So yeah, so it doesn't need to be this kind of nearly sensationalized thing. Sexual orientation awareness training can kind of demystify that and also help to address any biases that people might have that they might not even realize. So quite often when we do training with people, they sort of say, well, I treat everybody the same. I don't, but not that anything is kind of, not that people are intending to be homophobic or transphobic, but just highlighting ways that things can be done better. Things like being explicitly inclusive in resources, so in posters and leaflets showing same-sex couples and families. And then RSE, which I'm sure will be talked about by the other speakers as well, but training on what healthy relationships are. Quite often people don't recognise it. I know I'm speaking mainly about domestic abuse rather than broader violence against women and girls. But I think training on healthy relationships, it needs to be in the curriculum. It needs to be standardised no matter what school kids are at. They need to be taught about consent and what a healthy relationship is, not just the mechanics of how babies are made, which is quite often what it falls down to in schools still at the minute. It's a mechanical scientific approach, maybe with half a day on basically abstinence education. So we'd want to see RSE, comprehensive RSE, which is now incorporated in that CEDAW recommendation is now incorporated into legislation. So hopefully I've talked a bit about accountability. So hopefully if it isn't delivered on, we've got that measure to keep pointing politicians to. That's everything for me.
Thank you so much, Danielle. Thanks so much, Danielle. I think RSE is a
You're on mute, Elaine.
yes. I'm not muting myself. It seems to be happening by.
Apologies, I don't know what happened there, just in changing the spotlight. So anyway, on you go.
No worries. I was going to say thank you so much, Danielle. As you know, RSE is a really key area from the point of view of raise your voice, and talking about and modeling healthy relationships from a young age is a huge step to helping people avoid the kind of pitfalls of unhealthy relationships. So I'm going to go to the speakers from Women's Aid next, Karen or Sonia, whoever prefers to speak.
Okay, well, if we're looking at resource and a strategy to be able to, achieve its goals, of course, we need money, we need resources, we need a commitment from government before we move forward. We have the new legislation around the domestic abuse offence, the famous words that the only reason this went through was because there was no money attached to it, we know how much money the legislation costs. If we look at the training and development, if we look at PSNI, PPS, the IT changes, all of the rest of it, you know, it has to come in investment now. And, you know, looking at returning to a long-term grant funding for violence against women and girls provision, you know, let's, you know, really have the conversation. We're all pushed and stretched to the point that we start, as Danielle has pointed out, you know, you start projects, you invest in them, and then they go, you know, instead of, if this is really working well, why do we need a shiny new project that we have to fund? Just continue funding something that's working well. We're also putting charities against each other, you know, and this is something that never would have happened in this sector before. And I look at, you know, our own helpline provision, you know, a number of years ago that we lost in 2019, and Nexus then got that funding, and that's great. The service is still up and running and everything, which was absolutely brilliant. But, you know, why push people? That service was running well, the monitoring was going okay. It cost an awful lot of public money to go out for consultation and tender and procurement, and it's pushing people against each other. And there's a lack of recognition of specialism within services as well, and that's something we need to work on. One size does not fit all for, you know, all of this, and this is why it's so good to be having the conversation and not apologizing for talking around men's violence against women and girls, because we have been apologizing that for quite a few years now. We have to push ourselves, you know, square ourselves into a circle, or whatever that sign is, you know, and we shouldn't have to. You know, I work for Women's Aid, and I have no apology for that, because we support women, children and young people, and that's what we do. But instead, you know, you're trying to push yourself into some other thing to fit into a funding pot, and that's what we have to really focus on in relation to any conversations and consultation we have in relation to this. But this is life-saving work that we are doing, and that's why it's so key as well. And to be able to get, you know, any change to those attrition rates that we were talking about, any change to our sexual violence figures, as Elena pointed out within the recent bulletin from the Public Protection Service, you know, there's an awful lot of investment and money going in, but our figures aren't changing. And we know that the PSNI statistics are only the icing on, you know, we know that we would say about approximately 50% of women who come into our services don't contact the police as well. So back to Danielle's point around the data set as well, it is key. It really, really is key. But one of the major problems that we all face within all of this sector is funding. And people have to realize an investment now will save lives later. And of course, the whole piece, you know, early intervention, prevention, education, public awareness, of course it all costs money, but you know, our children and young people deserve it. They're the future, and we need to be able to ultimately have a strategy that can support our children and young people and make real positive change. You know, if we look at those, out of those 11 women that I keep going back to, you know, one of those women was a child in refuge. She returned as an adult. We have to break that cycle. There was no work done around family therapy for that whole family unit. Domestic abuse, if we're looking at one form of violence against women and girls, it affects the whole family, not just that one individual. So there's so much more work that we need to do to break this intergenerational trauma that we see within so many forms of violence against women and girls. And we fully recognise it is definitely not just domestic abuse. It crosses such a wide spectrum of work, and that's why we really need to target and speak to all the appropriate agencies, of which we don't have in Northern Ireland if we're looking at various, you know, around honour-based violence and different things, you know. So there's an awful lot of work needs done as well to make sure that we're up to speed. But funding commitments is key, but I'm sure we'll all be definitely singing from the same song sheet in relation to that one.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you so much, Sonia, for that. I'm going to pass that question to Ivanka, and then we can go to public questions. So again, if you've got any questions, do pop them in the chat. Thank you.
Oh, yes, I've unmuted myself. Sorry. Yeah. I've been taking furious notes throughout the event because I'm learning so much by just listening to the experts here. So I suppose I'm going to share kind of broader thoughts on prevention from a broader perspective, human rights perspective. Because I think it's probably unfair to expect that this strategy will solve the deeply rooted and historic issues that we're facing here. I think it will take a long time and it will take a lot of effort and supplementary legislation, a change in the public narrative, a change in the perception of women and children and their lives and their rights to achieve long-term change. So, for example, one of the things that I wanted to highlight was in human rights, we all often say that human rights are interconnected and interdependent, and you can't easily separate one set of rights from another. So in that sense, perhaps the success of the strategy against violence against women and children would also depend on the enforcement and success of other relevant strategies, such as the racial equality strategy, which is desperately overdue. It's ridiculous that we don't have a working strategy that tackles racial inequality and structural racism yet. And I think it would be difficult to ensure that a strategy against violence, gendered violence, is effective unless we also demand that the other tools we need are also looked after and we also push for them as well. In that sense, I think to achieve a long-term preventative strategy, one clear, if you wish, overlap I personally find between thinking about the structural nature of racism and the structural nature of domestic violence is the constant dehumanization and undervaluing of the lives of both racialized people and women and children. Dehumanization, and again, I'm thinking about the very negative experience of my country, Bulgaria. Dehumanization justifies not taking definitive and concrete action to tackle violence. An adjacent point would be, and I think we said that at the other day at the Reclaim the Night rally, it's difficult, just like it's difficult to separate human rights, it's also difficult to separate violences. So I'm specifically thinking about some of the most marginalized people in our community, which would be asylum seekers and refugees. We know that there are a number of barriers that they face when even trying to access services, if services are available to them when it comes to domestic violence, whether it's a language barrier, whether it's a fear of persecution from the Home Office and the inhumane immigration policies that we have, whether it's lack of funds, lack of means to seek for help, whether it's feeling like you are alone in a community. We can't separate, at least I personally can't separate in my brain, the violence of, let's say, direct provision or detention for migrants, treating migrants as criminals, asylum seekers and refugees as criminals, and then the violence that is gender, that very much flourishes because people are marginalized in their homes, in their heads, they're individualized, separated from each other. So I think a long-term effective strategy for the prevention of gender-based violence, of violence against women and girls would require, as I think all of us have agreed today, much more conversation, a lot of work, appropriate resourcing for the relevant sectors. I think Danielle said something extremely important, the co-production and effective involvement of various groups in the development of strategies, legislations, tools, methods, monitoring. So when we sit around the table, it's a truly representative table. I think all of these factors, plus everything that the experts have said about the strategy today, would hopefully help us achieve a long-term prevention strategy rather than just reacting at a piecemeal pace. Hope that was somewhat useful. That's me. Thanks very much.
That was fantastic. Thank you so much, Ivanka. And we come to the Q&A part of the event. And there's a few in the chat, and I'll just read those out now because I'm aware that Ivanka in particular has to move on in a hurry. So one of those is a series of comments from Catherine Ferran. and it refers to the Every Woman Treaty, which encompasses everything that's good within the Istanbul Convention, CEDAW, Maputo Protocol, I'm not going to attempt an accent, I'm afraid, Belém do Pará Convention. However, it supersedes all of the above by challenging world governments to endorse the Every Woman Treaty so that all women and girls have their human rights protected. And there's some more detail on exactly what the 5 prongs of that approach are in the chat. And there's a link to the treaty, and I can pop that in the chat for everyone in just a moment. So I don't know if anybody wants to comment on that, but there's one other question as well. Sort of question comment is from Sifo, and it says, one would think that this kind of strategy exists already. Also, you would think it would be a no-brainer that we would have such a strategy in existence. Is domestic violence only starting to be reported now, or was the reporting just being ignored? I don't know if anybody wants to come in that, but we'll start with Ivanka. Oh, you're on mute, I'm afraid, Ivanka, sorry. You have to dash?
I have to dash. I'm really sorry. However, I'm trying.
Okay.
I can only send it to you, Elaine, or to Helen, my email, if you want to share it in the chat. I'll be more than happy to chat further or answer any questions via email. And thank you so much for having me today.
Thank you for coming. Thank you very much, Ivanka. So I'll pass that to Danielle then.
I can't see the questions written down, but yeah. No,
I'm not sure. The settings on this is sending the questions only to myself and Helen, okay. And then she's sending them on to me. So it's a little circuitous.
Yeah, I hadn't heard of the Every Woman Treaty. That sounds interesting. Yeah, and also I know just before the question, yeah, the point about like charities competing with each other, yeah, it shouldn't be. It shouldn't have to be this way. And I don't think it is in how we work. But then they're behind the scenes, you've got like funding applications going, and whereas I think our actual work and our goals are all very much shared. And yeah, we have the particular expertise to draw on, and everybody's doing the best they can. And yeah, everybody, Women's Aid are doing amazing work. And yeah, it would be nice if we could have something that was funded and not precarious and that could keep going. I think there has been increased attention because of the high profile cases over the past year or so, both here and in England. But as Sonia highlighted, 11 women have been killed in Northern Ireland. We've got such high femicide rates. Yet it seems like the horrendous cases of Sarah Everard and Sabina Nessa, they're making the headlines, and rightly so, but so much is happening here as well that it just hasn't got the same attention. So I think there is, while domestic abuse has been reported, it hasn't really been top of politicians' agenda, so it hasn't been getting the political attention. And then as well as that, if you look at like Monica McWilliams and Jessica Doyle's work at UU, there are particular Northern Ireland barriers to reporting domestic abuse and accessing help. So, and I know Women's Aid have recently had some work out as well on paramilitaries, or some comments recently on paramilitaries still being involved and still exerting control in domestic abuse in a way that doesn't happen elsewhere. So I think there's partly the lack of political attention, and also our particular circumstances in Northern Ireland where there was additional barriers for people reporting and seeking help, which still exists now, even though we're supposed to be, well, what are we, 20 plus years after a peace process is being processed. But yeah, we're not free from it yet.
Absolutely, Danielle. And I think comments about paramilitarism came up as well when we did some primary research about stalking for our response to the stalking Protection from Stalking Bill consultation, and it struck me at last weekend when the newspapers were reporting that Northern Ireland was one of the most dangerous places in Europe to be a woman, was the way it was phrased. And just there was an onslaught of people saying, that's nonsense, that's not true. And they were just looking the statistics in the eye and saying, nope, not a problem. And we just aren't very good at talking about these things. It's like they're uncomfortable, they're supposed to be private, and therefore we don't want to talk about them. And that might be one of the reasons why we're so far behind in so many ways, as well as the political agenda. I wonder what you think about that, Karen and Sonia.
Hi everyone. Yes, so just even reflecting on that, I'm currently just pouring through the police statistic at the minute that were released for the last financial year in November there, and it is, people are increasingly reporting over the years since they were first recorded in 2004, 2005, and I think as Danielle highlighted, there is that extra layer of context that, as we kind of progress from like a Good Friday Agreement, people having more confidence in coming forward. I suppose as well, the changes in the law as well make help build more confidence in people for reporting. It could be a case as well, as Sonia highlighted earlier, people come to us for support, but it could be that they never actually report what's happened to them to the police as well. So it could be as well that that under reporting still obviously exists, but it's making sure that changes in the law, like the law next year changing, making course of control of crime in Northern Ireland, and the big kind of media campaign that's going to happen when that law change, when the law changes, it will be that, and I look forward to seeing the figures next year to see that increase, because I know there's people who, once that law changes, they feel confident coming forward going, this is what's happened to me. So it's a mixture of, as Danielle highlighted, the context of Northern Ireland and people that fear of going to the police and the paramilitary element, but also the changes in the law, and as every year the stats are increasing, but as we know, it is still underreported, but it's just making sure that people know that the support is there and really raising that awareness. So I think as someone commented, was it always there and was ignored? It's probably one of those things that just as the awareness of coming out of that post-conflict society, is people realizing what the law is and how it's changing and how it'll help them, and the support that's there more importantly as well. So it's definitely something that's going to increase. I think we'll definitely see those figures, reporting figures, jump up even more next year when the law changes.
Absolutely, Karen. I've noticed there in the chat somebody has said community policing by paramilitary and community groups is a huge issue, as is their influence in health and housing. And I mean, I think a lot of us have seen that in various pieces of research that has been done. We're here 24 years, 23, I can't remember, after the Good Friday Agreement, and we're still in this same cycle of sort of coercive control on a grand scale of entire communities. And it is the elephant in the room nobody really wants to talk about. Or if they do try to talk about it, it's not getting the traction that it needs. And we've got years of fantastic work by people like Monica McWilliams to look at on that, but it's not being heard in the right rooms, I guess, to result in any meaningful action. So thank you all for coming today. We're going to close now because we are just before 2 o'clock. I want to thank all of our speakers, first of all, Sonia and Karen, Danielle, and also Ivanka, who's had to head on. Thank you also to the Human Rights Festival for hosting this event. This has all been recorded and it'll be available on our website, and we can send it to anybody who needs it as well if you get in touch with us. Our website is raiseyourvoice.community. You can find out more about the various pieces of work that we're involved in if you haven't heard of us before. So thank you very much, everyone, and goodbye.